Flipped, a professional development program for higher degree supervisors and students. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to this Flipped professional development session. And we're exploring communication strategies between students and supervisors in difficult times. If I'm ever asked about what causes a breakdown in a supervisory system, I often have two answers. They are maxims for your consideration. Students and supervisors have assumptions, and two, students and supervisors have assumptions that they're unable to communicate to others. Assumptions don't kill a doctorate, but assumptions that are not shared do. Isn't it amazing that we don't teach overtly about the importance of communication between students and supervisors? We are talking today about how to create, how to improve a communication system between students and a student supervisor. And at the end of this session, I offer 5 ideas for us to trial to enhance a student's communication with supervisors and others. This area has some emerging research. Guzev et al. In their fine article in the 2020 journal Higher Education titled their piece, quote, "Superhero or Hands-Off Supervisor," end of quote. They conducted an empirical study of supervisory styles and student satisfaction in Russian universities. They showed that the hands-off supervisor reported the lowest levels of student satisfaction, obviously, but perhaps more intriguingly, they also demonstrated the longest time to degree completion. The superhero supervisor, as you may have guessed, revealed the highest levels of student satisfaction, but also the shortest candidatures. And why were these supervisors so good? Well, one reason was that they performed the managerial, administrative, expert and mentoring functions effectively. So this was a fine piece of research, but this empirical study did not ask why these styles were chosen, because for every great leader, there's a great follower. For every mentor, there's a mentee. For every expert, there is a willing listener who holds the disciplinary literacy to decode those words. So with the focus on great supervisors or dodgy supervisors, superheroes or the hands-off supervisor, we're sort of missing the point. This is not about the supervisor, it's in fact not about the student, it's about the space in between, the space where communication takes place. Communication through much of the last 100 years has been understood as a very simple process. Indeed, this was called the process school of communication. There is a sender of information and the receiver of information. And here we go with the craziness. The receiver supposedly receives the information as the sender intended. Yeah. Right, so think about Twitter or X, think about any text message. The reason why the process school modal trope of communication was so wrong is it assumed that the sender and the receiver shared the same context. This is, of course, wrong. So the next series of communication theories, many involving semiotics or social semiotics, argued that communication is reliant on understanding the context, the environment in which communication takes place. So today we're talking about communication in context and bringing communication and context together to create a strong supervisory relationship. The tragedy is, I think, that communication skills are one of those tick-a-box skills. In every job application, we talk about generic competencies, transferable skills. Communication is supposedly the number one skill, but we take it for granted. What does that phrase, communication skills, even mean? What is communication? There is an assumption that communication is natural. Actually, all communication is in context. Communication is constructed. It requires a speaker or a writer in context to connect with a listener or reader in context. If the context or if we want to go all posh about it, if the literacy is not shared, then communication does not take place. But mostly we all assume that everyone talks just like us and everyone agrees with us. But think about how often we have conversations in our own heads. We talk to ourselves and we rehearse endlessly what we should have said. But we need to remember that supervisory relationships are part of a workplace. They are professional communication. Professional communication, or Profcom, is a long-standing and established field, and there is some fine research in this area emerging in graduate studies. And I log a great article by Krishna Hoffman-Longtin et al., published in 2021, titled, quote, "Rethinking Graduate Student Socialisation and Identification," end of quote. She argues that communication is everything to a doctoral program because it is the foundation of a student's professional identity. We as students, we as supervisors, must focus on communication because we are building an organisational discourse. You see, supervisors are teaching socialisation into academic life through this communication. Remember that fine research from Gusev on the Russian university system that started our session today? The superhero supervisors shared their experiences of higher education. But the students had to be open to hear, open to listen to the institutional communication skills being taught. Professional communication requires preparation. So this is why, for example, students construct an agenda or a list of questions when they're going into their weekly or fortnightly meetings. And students take notes from that meeting and then send follow-up emails asking questions about concepts or ideas that the student didn't understand. This means that the contexts of the supervisor and the student, the knowledge systems of the students and supervisors are shared so that the content makes sense. It's these iterative strategies that we make sure that contexts conflate, contexts overlap, so that content overlaps. So preparation for communication exchanges is crucial, and feedback for clarity is crucial. Right, so we're finding strategies to connect the context of the supervisor and the context of the student. So what else can a student do to enable communication? And the answer is obviously listening. So much of our culture is based on speaking and preparing to speak, but speaking is not communicating. Communication is based on listening. Listening is so important because it builds connections, it builds relationships. Listening also creates the space for the development of interpretations. So listening is not the space before a student can talk again. It is the opportunity to understand the world of someone else. That means a student is understanding a worldview. And yes, this does mean that supervisors must also really listen to their students. And if one of these parties don't understand something, we need to ask questions. Most of the time, communication between students and supervisors is effective in some form, but during a candidature there will be difficult conversations. A student or a student supervisor is angry, is frustrated. Well, these aren't pleasant dialogues. And I always think how to freak somebody out is to say, "We're about to have a difficult conversation." And if we're dealing with anger or frustration, my first rule is always to let that human being have their say. And if they need to offload, then let them offload. Silence is much more damaging and frightening than anything another human can say. Because if someone stays in silence, the silent treatment, they are blocking communication. They're not allowing a student or a supervisor to see their context. Now, I have to participate in many different and difficult conversations. So I start these difficult conversations with students or supervisors with statements like, "How can I be of assistance to you today? What would you like me to know? What is a strong resolution for you today?" These are certainly tough sessions, these are tough questions, and I've certainly met my share of supervisors and students who don't want a resolution, who don't want improvement, who don't want an outcome. They just want to sit in a grievance. And the complaint becomes the life's work. They just can't get out of the complaint. And these people live in that complaint. They become the complaint. They become the anger. They become the resentment. And resolutions are just not possible. And that's why we need to nurture our communication systems right at the beginning of the candidature, because these systems can be destroyed so easily and so quickly. The key with communication is to be aware of a student's background, be aware of a student's environment. Whatever a student may say or write, the content doesn't matter if it hasn't been tailored for a specific audience and context. So I'll finish our short gig today with 5 quick suggestions or strategies for you to think about to improve the communication system between a student and a supervisor. 1. Don't assume that a convenient mode of communication for you is convenient for anybody else. Interface management is the first key step in effective communication. We must not assume that the mode of communication in which a student is most comfortable may be shared with a supervisor. Interface management is the first key step in effective communication. We must not assume that the mode of communication for one person is the mode of communication for another. So at the start of a student's candidature, talk about the best modes of communication and find that effective interface where both a student and a supervisor can succeed and thrive. 2. Don't assume that the quickest mode of communication is the best. We live in an age where convenience is more important than quality and speed is more important than clarity. We must never hurry or hasten a communication mode. We mustn't throw off an angry email or send that weird text message on a weekend. A student's relationship with a supervisor is part of organisational culture and therefore requires professional communication. It requires calm, reflexive and considered communication modes. And I have a maxim in my professional life: the more important something is, the more time goes into that initial communication moment, because it sets the tone for the rest of the conversation. So we aim for quality communication, not fast communication. 3, value synchronous communication and recognise how asynchronous communication can enable it. Meetings in real time are important, and the students that finish quickly have weekly meetings. But the research shows that it doesn't matter if that weekly meeting is face-to-face in an office or face-to-face via Zoom or Teams. So value that face-to-face time and create lots and lots of asynchronous feeders into it if you can. What this means is we make a meeting count. We prepare an agenda where a student shares with a student supervisor their expectations, and we expect written work. If it helps a student, I always used to approach my meetings with students with 5 questions, the key questions that are then the springboard for the rest of their work for the week. These questions and the notes from students formulate a strong supervisory meeting. They give it a structure and they give it a momentum. 4, formalise a student's communication. Write every email as if a student's boss or mother will read it. The consequences of Facebook, Twitter and text messaging is that we communicate with everyone as if they are our girlfriend or a drug dealer. Make a decision that in a student's correspondence with colleagues that formalised writing is deployed. I put this in a different way for my colleagues and my students. Every message I write, I assume it will be read in a court. When letters and faxes were written, remember faxes? When faxes were written, they had that formal quality to them. But because email was and is used for leisure and work, there is a blurring between text messages, Facebook Messenger, Instagram comments, and email. So make a decision to formalise student emails. Australians have a tendency to CC half of the population of the Northern Territory into their emails. So we always have to look at what a student has written. Would a student be happy for their supervisor, their mother, their vice-chancellor to read that email? Because the chances these days is that they will. We can bet on a few things. One thing we can bet is the person who we send an email to will not be the only person who reads it. We also have to recognise that the misreading of emails is a site of incredible conflict between students and supervisors. Each year, hundreds of emails are forwarded to me as Dean, and they come from both students and supervisors. And the explanatory note is, this email was a deal breaker for me. At this point now, the relationship is over. And 5, don't assume a student or a supervisor availability for an immediate reply to a message. This is a final difficult truth. We want our supervisors to be superheroes, but Batman has left Gotham City and Superman has been bowed by the kryptonite of COVID. A student supervisor, like most academics in our university now, are tired, really tired. And remember, research is showing that the average academic works 60 hours a week. They don't get days off, they don't get holidays, their family, their friends are neglected. So if a student's colleague or a student supervisor hasn't replied, that is incredibly sad, and I'm really sorry about that. If your supervisor hasn't read the draft, I'm really sorry about that. But that's the point I'm making today about understanding the context around communication. Students and supervisors must talk about their timetables, must talk about their lived reality each week. So for students and supervisors, talk about higher education, talk about the timing of the return of that draft, and that reality will allow a stronger communication system to emerge. Thank you for sharing your time with me today, and I look forward to our seminar.